privacy is a team sport. You need to be so multidisciplinary. There's marketing and there's technology and there's compliance and there's legal and nobody can do all of those things. But technology is a great skill to have. Ultimately, it's about data. I know that we can get into the human rights element of privacy and things like that. But in our day-to-day world, mostly it's really about data. So where's data? Where does it flow? What's a cradle to grave? And having a technical background, you can sort of understand and sort of unpack, how did we get the data? How does it get moved across? How is that transfer? Data in transit, data at rest. But hang on, who owns the keys? You can start to unpack some of these things.
Welcome to Privacy in Practice, the podcast where we bring you the latest insights, practical solutions, and real-world stories from the world of data protection and privacy. I'm Kelly Dupree.
And I'm Donnie Strachen. Privacy in Practice is brought to you by VeriSafe, your trusted partner in privacy and data protection. In this podcast, we dig into the challenges and opportunities in privacy compliance, from navigating complex regulations to building a sustainable privacy program that works for your business, not against it.
So let's jump in and get practical with privacy. Today, we're excited to welcome Sean Milford to the podcast. Sean is a seasoned expert in data privacy, privacy engineering, and cybersecurity, with over 20 years of experience bridging the gap between technology, privacy, and compliance.
Sean currently serves as the head of global data privacy at Syndigo, where he leads privacy initiatives across a diverse range of industries, from retail to technology. Previously, he's worked at organizations like PwC, Visa, HSBC, and Dell Technologies, focusing on privacy governance and engineering, and helping businesses navigate complex privacy challenges in today's data-driven world. At the same time as doing all of that, Sean is also nearing the completion of an advanced master's in privacy, cybersecurity, and data management at Maastricht University in the Netherlands.
With his deep understanding of privacy engineering, vendor management, and the evolving global regulatory landscape, Sean brings invaluable insights into how organizations can build robust privacy programs and manage privacy risks effectively. Welcome, Sean. It's really wonderful to have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to it. And thank you for the invite.
It's a pleasure. We are really looking forward to today's conversation. We want to start with a question about your background. How did you get into privacy in the first place?
I think privacy seems to creep on most of us, don't they? When I've spoken to a lot of friends, they sometimes always seem to fall into it. For me, it was a bit strange. My background is a techie. I was a software developer and then ran software development teams. And then I got into cybersecurity and I thought, right, I'm going to be going down the cybersecurity route. But at one point we had attempted hacks on a website and that sort of said, well, hang on, there's people being affected at the same time. So is it a cybersecurity issue? Is there a privacy issue? So we reported it to the police, of course, and then also, did we have to report it to ICO? But this was pre-GDPR. But it's certainly, I think it was sort of the fork in the road, and then you started to do compliance checks. Are we being privacy compliant? How are we doing from security? And so I always like to say that cybersecurity or privacy and technology or cybersecurity almost like two sides of a coin, or I like to say joined at the hip. So that's how I sort of fell into it as I started to be a little bit more on the privacy side. But what I love to do is just, I don't like to get too far away from technology spaces, environments, because I always like a good technical debate and discussion. But then there's the legal side as well. But I try to stay away too much from the lawyers and stay in the middle of it.
I know we've talked about it, and I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later, that balancing act of what the law says versus what the engineers actually can and want to do.
Exactly. So that's my route. And 10 years later, at least, I'm in privacy, so yeah.
Sean, I'm wondering about your technical background and how that helps you to bridge those gaps. So you often have privacy teams where someone is a lawyer or a compliance specialist, or someone is an IT manager or a CIO, and I think it's rare to find someone that can wear all those hats, because obviously everyone specializes in something. Do you find that your technical background helps people to understand the legal issues better and how to implement that in practice? Does that put you in a better or worse position? How do you experience that?
My experience is it helps and it hinders. Sometimes I think you start to get into too much detail when you don't need to. Overall, I think it helps. It really makes a huge difference. So for me, when something comes up, I always feel It's like a doctor that feels something's not quite right. Something's out, but they can't put their finger on it, so they'll go do some tests. It's the same thing for me. I might not know the latest technology. I haven't written code for quite some time, but instinctively, because I grew up with computers, built computers, then wrote code, and then left that, I instinctively have a sense of how things should work, or if things intuitively just doesn't make sense. Something more is going on here, or what often happens is the lawyers will look at it at the top level, but they don't think about a lot of the other things. There's logs, there's systems, there's crossing different system boundaries and things like that. So for me, technology helps you to unpack a lot of stuff. But one of the things I learned quite a long time ago, firstly, I think data privacy is a team sport, because you alluded to it, your technical skill and the legal skill. But in privacy, you need to be so multidisciplinary. There's marketing and there's technology and there's compliance and there's legal, and nobody can do all of those things. But I think technology is a great skill to have that brings a lot to it, because ultimately it's about data. I know that we can get into the human rights element of privacy and things like that, but in our day-to-day world, mostly it's really about data. So where's data? Where does it flow? What's a cradle to grave? And having a technical background, you can sort of understand and sort of unpack, how did we get the data? How does it get moved across? How is that transfer? Data in transit, data at rest. But hang on, who owns the keys? You can start to unpack some of these things.
Another distinction that one could also make is between privacy engineering and privacy operations and privacy compliance. Can you tell us a little bit more in terms of your role, what privacy engineering would involve? Do you get involved in that, and what does that entail?
I really think that was really, really interesting watching privacy evolve over the last 10 years, at least from my experiences, is this evolution from privacy by design to privacy engineering, and then privacy operations, privacy compliance. So all of these disciplines have evolved to become more mature. And quite a lot of that is not new. It builds on best practice in other sectors. So, for example, for me, privacy by design was the big buzzword, especially around GDPR coming in. I think it's a great thing to talk about at the high level. We used to call it privacy at whatever the company was. The at symbol. It was great fun to create a site for that, to help people understand what is privacy, how do I understand it, how do I engage with the privacy team, when do I need to engage with them. So that's operations for me, but it's also operations. That's for business operations, but you also got operations for privacy teams. So it's quite complicated, and it can be a whole discussion in its own right. But I think you need to break it down and document it, because people, being honest, especially business people, privacy is the last thing I think about. They've got deadlines, they've got sales to meet, a marketing campaign to get live, etc. So how do you make things as straightforward as possible and clear in a documented process? Because they don't want to get into the weeds of our philosophies and principles and things like that. What does it mean in my context? What are the next things I need to do? So I think we need to bring the business with us, but also being mindful it's not the top thing on their mind. It's just naturally, just one of 100 things that they're going to do. Exactly the same thing with privacy engineering. Engineering teams are not naturally interested in that. So for me is, how do you take privacy and make it more sound like an engineering requirement or an operations requirement or whatever it is, or a data requirement? Say, look, you don't need to keep this data because it's going to make things messy. You don't have good quality data to rely on when you're doing your next campaign. Let's delete it. So absolutely, we need to get into legal concepts and privacy concepts, but how do you blend it into things that people are doing already?
I'm just reminded, you're right. I also find those 7 principles of the privacy by design to be quite a Venn diagram, if you will, sort of a flower shape. But I think that I was struck by what you said. I'm just thinking about sort of some of those principles. And in some ways, part of that translation function is to realize who's most responsible for which. So maybe the rights or the transparency might sit more closely with the legal side or the compliance side, whereas the minimization and the security might sit more with, it all overlaps in our flower analogy. But, I think sometimes the lawyers can focus a bit more on the transparency and the data subject's experience. And sometimes you can ignore the stuff happening on the minimization front or on the security front because it's sort of back-end and technical. And I think that's absolutely as critical in many ways. So it's important to kind of, I was just thinking about that as you were speaking, that that's an important component of being able to speak between the two disciplines, if you will.
When you say that, that's just so interesting. So, for example, for the engineering teams, you could talk more in languages of security. So let's let's obfuscate or let's mask the data, or, so that we don't bring ourselves at a risk of identity theft. Well, actually, that delivers a privacy requirement as well. But today, the biggest concern is security. So can you map them and almost build it out? And the nice thing about the Cloud Security Alliance, for example, the Cloud Maturity Model, CMM, but they've got a fantastic model, which is more cloud-based, but they started to blend a lot of things. So in their latest version 4 from memory, they've included a domain called DSP, so data security and privacy. And you can suddenly see that they're trying to blend a lot of stuff because it's not just one thing. Privacy is needed, but security is needed, etc. And so at one organization, we used that as our baseline framework, which allowed us then to link, to build out, and it was a huge undertaking, but to build out controls that map to each one of those to help us to become ISO certified 27001, SOC 2s, all those things. Because as a massive organization selling us products and platforms, we had lots of customers. Well, prove your security, prove this, etc. So how can you also build a program that is sustainable or tries to build it into things that people are doing anyway? So, yeah. And then the transparency piece, to me, is the most complicated of the lot. I think firstly is making the teams at the forefront of product development responsible for it. So at one company, we made sure that every time a team wanted to introduce something new or a new process, they had to try to review the privacy policy to at least say, we think it's covered. At least then when we did the review, we could say, we agree or we need to expand it. But at least it's a good start. It forced them into the mindset of, for me to get this live, one of my 1,000 steps in my project management Bible was doing X, Y, Z. But it helped them to make sure, are we being clear? Conversely, unfortunately, because GDPR has become so legalistic, nobody reads the privacy policies, which is a shame. People just don't bother. So I think it's almost gone the opposite end, that actually we're not delivering the benefits that GDPR wanted. It's just become so arcane that people are not given enough information. So it's a tough one. And this is where you have to make business decisions and risk-based decisions and try to find ways. In fact, one of the best ones I saw, but I forget, was it almost had the privacy policy down one side of a page, and this means X, this sort of simplified version. Another one I loved had little boxes and just had the very brief, we won't sell your data. And then if you clicked on the box, it would expand and show you the legalistic version. And so how can we gamify it a little bit just to make it a little bit easier? And so I'd love to see iconography come live. Lots of people try to come up with the idea. GDPR says you could use imagery to bring it to life, but there's no standard nomenclature. There's no standard way to describe these ones. On foods, there was the red labeling, wasn't it? And so now if it's got high salt or whatever. But privacy, we haven't got there yet. So the German regulators, they've got their own version. So there's a couple floating out there, but it's never got traction. So I'd love to see something like that, a traffic light for privacy. Wouldn't that be fantastic to make it easier for people to understand? So, yeah.
There is this constant tension between trying to comply with each individual law and trying to build a holistic privacy program. And I think, if I understand you correctly, that's the approach that one could follow, is to say, well, let's look at the key requirements. Let's see which laws have the most complicated or strangest requirements, and then try and build one framework that can address all of those requirements. You'll never be perfect, but then at least you have something that's substantially compliant versus trying to create a compliance framework for each and every individual country, bearing in mind that there are such stark differences between some of the jurisdictions. I'm curious though would you use the GDPR as the baseline? Would you use the OECD principles, or sort of, what would you use to build that framework around? Could it be GDPR plus US laws, but then which US law do you take? Any thoughts on that?
I think something I didn't actually touch on, we mustn't forget, you also need to understand your sector, your industry, etc. So you need to understand if you're in a health sector, well, you've got a much higher benchmark to that. So we mustn't forget context is king. I love that phrase, context is king. We need to understand what you're doing and who's affected. I think all of us who get into privacy, well, not everybody, but a large number of us, is because there's an individual behind us that's affected. So we need to understand those tensions between that. I think OECD principles are really good, and you could use them. You've got the Convention 108, Convention 108 plus. You can use something. create a benchmark for yourself and then peg around it what you need to do. As I said before, I guess that's a long story, but what I'm trying to say is it's the intent behind it that we're trying to drive. So the intent is what we need to get back to. And I think that's exactly what the CCPA is trying to do. The same thing is for Californian consumers. Fundamentally, it was never intended as a compliance thing. Just tick the boxes and put it in the box. Most organizations see it as a compliance function, but it's meant to, again, my favorite phrase, do the right thing for individuals. And if we try to do that and we document our processes, even if we're wrong sometimes, I think, and you can show that to the regulator, if your intent is in the right place, and you can prove to the regulator why you think that you're not impacting the rights of individuals, then I think that's the best you can do. So again, to your point, which ones do you choose? Well, what I've chosen was GDPR and CCPA just because of the markets we work in. But you need to see what are your benchmarks and your regulators, and then you need to decide how you're going to adapt it for your market. Then do you want to be regional? Because you might decide that actually the benefit we're driving for the individuals is a product that is not buggy and is slow and doesn't perform, and yet we also be compliant, because ultimately you have to be compliant. You then might want to regionalize it. But remember, every time you make a decision, you're also putting a burden. You're putting a burden on yourselves to try to prove that, and a burden on your engineering teams, a burden on the operations teams to monitor it, etc. So we always need to balance all these different needs, the commercial needs, the individual needs, the operational needs, etc. So, as I said, privacy is a complex game.
It's such a complex game. I was thinking about you talking about the California law and doing the right thing. And I think, especially, we all come from some background. Yours is technical, mine's US law, Donnie's is South African law. So it always, you do need our own set of translations, even within our own minds. And for me, it always helps to think of US privacy laws as consumer protection laws. And the way to do the right thing is, if you're not going to, you don't want to sell somebody a toaster that's going to blow up. You don't want to sell somebody a kid toy that's going to have them choke, and you don't want to sell somebody an online product that's going to misuse their data. I think that's how I try to, it's different, I suppose, from a European human rights perspective, but it's also not in the same way. Yeah, you're thinking of the person.
But GDPR, couldn't we just simplify it? That, fundamentally, are we trying to protect people? Are we doing the right thing? But is it unfair or is it deceptive? And that's exactly the question. That's fundamentally what we're trying to get to. But I think competition law is really interesting when you look at the interplay, because, of course, from a competition law space, you tend to think of it in the old world, which is you pay for goods and services. But in the digital world, it's increasingly that you're paying in different ways, which is your data. Is that a fair trade? But then, anyway, we're getting into a concept of the pay or consent models, and that's gone through some huge interesting debates, and people wanting it to be fair, to be free, to have an equivalent alternative, but they don't want you to use the data. But in the old world, the offline world, you used to pay for your services. So where do you draw the lines? Where do you protect individuals but give access and allow corporations to make money? Because ultimately, if they're making money, they're innovating. But we in privacy and in compliance teams need to try to make sure they do it in the right way. So do the right thing, as I said, it's one of my favorite phrases. We can make sure we're the smell test. Is it doing the right thing for the individuals and the business? So, yeah.
Speaking of the complexity of all of these various challenges and programs across the various regimes, can we talk a little bit about vendor management? Because I think that one is a place where some of these differences emerge in terms of, there's the very clear specific difference that the contract terms you need to be compliant with the CCPA are different than the GDPR. There's also the conception of the roles of the parties, right? You have controller processor in the GDPR. You have business third-party service provider in the CCPA. You have different roles in other US states. Then there's also, of course, the just sheer legal logistical stuff about transfer mechanisms from under the GDPR and a variety of other things. So you've been in a couple different situations and a couple different privacy programs. Do you have a preferred method of sort of managing this beast of vendor compliance or management?
Vendor management is a huge, complicated process. It really is. It's a minefield. And in fact, you can spend your life just doing vendor management, just in the privacy space, for example. You know what I mean? Because that's just so complicated. You can spend your life just doing contract reviews and security reviews and all that kind of stuff under the guise of the privacy space. I think for me, again, we need to try to say that privacy is just one element in a well-functioning organization. So for me, you need to try to embed it into processes that exist already, supply risk management or vendor risk management, etc. So I think the more you can embed it into other processes, the better it is. The other thing for me is you need to think about it from cradle to grave, is what I like to call it. So we're thinking about when you're onboarding the vendor, you're doing the pre-onboarding assessments, contractual assessments, onboarding, ongoing assessments, and then of course you terminate the agreement either in a friendly or an unfriendly way. But I think you need an overarching structure that supports it. And then I think what you're saying is, well, how do you do it from a privacy point of view? And that's complicated because firstly, you get into all the hagglings. What's your negotiation power compared to theirs? For example, we all know it's very hard to negotiate with the massive multi-billion-pound organizations. We won't mention them, but there's a couple of the big ones that it's highly unlikely you're going to change the terms. Also, if you decided that you wanted to turn up and audit their facilities, you know what reaction you'll get for things like that. So we have to be pragmatic. And again, as we talked about earlier, you need to understand your sector, what you're trying to achieve, what type of data it is. And so for me, I think tiering is a huge thing, or categories, or whatever term we want to use, is important in that space. And then risk categorizing it. So I'm not saying I've ever done this perfectly, but there's been some areas where it's a really mature framework, others where you're trying to build it up on skeleton teams. And that's the other challenge. You've got small teams and so much to do: vendor management, contract management, new engineering and design and translations and policy reviews. So it's quite a complicated space. But in the vendor space, I think just fundamentally is get your building blocks clearly documented. More than likely, it's good to get legal advice from externals, so you've got a framework or a checklist or something like that. But what I try to do is have what are your key things you're going to check. I've created checklists against GDPR Article 28, CCPA's got its areas, SCCs and things like that. So you need to figure out what does good look like criteria. What are you willing not to worry about negotiating because you just don't have the power? Well, audit is exactly one of them. And so is that really a big deal if it's just a few people's email addresses and stuff like that to access a portal, and yet you're doing a 20-page DPA or 100-page DPA? It's just, to me, sometimes it's a bit crazy versus the risk. But I think understanding your criteria, and I just come back to it, is risk categorization. Those two are key, because if you're at least able to understand that, because people forget that as you bring on new vendors or partners or whatever you're putting under that third party or risk management framework, you need to do ongoing audits with them as well. So are they a tier 0 or a category 1 or a high vendor, whatever terminology you want to use, based on business need, on value to the business, data processing, try to make it business context, not just purely privacy. It could allow you then to contextualize if and when you need to do ongoing audits. Is it annually? Is it 18 months? Every 2 years? Never, because it's pen and paper. So I think classification is important. And then also understanding the types of data, and that helps you to work out where, even though GDPR Article 28 says you shall have I'm not going to be able to negotiate that which we just discussed. And is it even materially important? Because, for example, audit, and yet it's only very basic business contact data. So you need to build up a program that understands your needs and your challenges in terms of the risk and what they're doing for you. And I think for me, what I've seen the most complicated is two things. One is your contract, and does it change because, of course, the evolving regulatory landscape. So, we had the fun where suddenly there was a new SCC and everybody was scrambling. I remember September was the big date and everybody was running around trying to review and repaper everybody and, or et cetera. So I think trying to figure out your transfer mechanisms is a bit of a chess game as well, because you think, and what you advised is, let's stay safe. Let's use SCCs. That's basically what you said. The European SCCs, model contract clauses, are the best thing. Because, hey, the European Commission gave it to us. They're safe. Until they decide to change it as well. So you think that, well, you use privacy shield. No, that fell. I think the point I was trying to say is, use the basics, adequacy, SCCs, BCRs. If that doesn't work, you have to go to you could also rely on other mechanisms like your DPF.
So the data privacy framework, I think, is actually quite a hot topic at the moment. So for those listeners that don't know what this is, it's a framework that basically allows transfers of personal data from organizations in the EU and the UK to the US. And it's a useful mechanism, but if you have to transfer it to an organization in the US that has certified to the DPF. So obviously that involves a process. The organization needs to go through various steps in order to get certified. And then once they're certified, they can receive data from Europe based on the adequacy of the DPF. But the DPF replaced Privacy Shield, which replaced the safe harbor. So I think the important thing is to realize that these things do change, and you have to make sure that you have some kind of fallback mechanism. So I find that what many people do in their agreements with their vendors is to have alternative mechanisms. So they have the SCCs, maybe there are BCRs that they can rely on. If the vendor in the US is DPF certified, obviously that's very convenient, and you just have to make sure that you have a fallback if something should go wrong at some stage. But from what I understand at the moment, things are still stable. The EU and the US seem to be committed to keep this data privacy framework in place. There will be challenges. There are challenges in the courts in Europe, but as things stand, we have the DPF. It's stable. If there is a challenge, it will go through the whole court process. It will take a while. And then we'll see what the courts decide about the validity of the DPF. But I think the DPF is still a useful mechanism, and people shouldn't discount it at this stage. If you can get DPF certified, go that route. I also find that DPF certification is useful for many organizations because you have to check yourself, if you're a US organization, against the principles in the DPF. And it's a very good health check. It's a good housekeeping exercise to see, do you actually comply with these standard principles in the DPF, and make sure that you get your compliance in order if you want to get certified to the DPF. So I find the DPF still very useful. I don't think one should push it aside at this stage. I just want to get your sense with DPF certification. From what I understand, you've already gone through that process. How did you find that? What was sort of the challenges, sort of anything that you've experienced that you can share?
I think just coming back on what you said there, Donnie, firstly, we shouldn't discount it. Absolutely. It's listed on the EU Commission's list of adequacy, regions, countries, whatever you want to refer to it. It is for commercial entities there. So it is an adequacy mechanism that you can rely on. But you can't rely on it in the same way as you can rely on other countries. So I always warn people, that's not good enough. Oh, great, they've got DPS. Stop. Check. Go to the data process framework list of entities, check what they covered for, just to make sure the scope is correct. But in terms of getting certified to it, I think it's a good framework, and I would certainly recommend people do go down that route. It's not binding corporate rules, BCRs, which is hugely complicated and challenging. My experience is that it's not too onerous. There is things that you need to do, reviews, checks. They do come back and push. And so I think it takes time, but I think they're getting better at it. However, I think it's not as onerous as BCRs and things like that. And I would highly recommend organizations look into that as a mechanism. And then lastly, just to your point, it's not the only thing that organizations do. So to your point is, I think lots of people got burnt because of Privacy Shield, Safe Harbor, etc. So a lot of BPAs try to have a belt and braces. So they try to rely on that. If that fails, we will then rely on, and then they also include the SCCs as well. So you can understand why there's the belt and braces approach. But make your life easier. Try to rely on the least or the most efficacy approach you can, which is adequacy, DPF, etc. And I find SCCs painful to fill out, and it's just painful to have to continuously fill out all these forms. But at least it's a belt and braces approach. So yeah, but DPF absolutely. And there are some great organizations I've heard of who help you get certified. I want to make sure that we talk about that relationship between the business and the privacy teams, etc., because we talked about that stuff.
Yeah, I think that's very useful.
So for me, as we said, so privacy is a team sport. Part of what our role in privacy teams is to help lead the business, the teams in terms of being compliant, but being pragmatic as well. And so I always like to think about it as firstly, it's about translating between the different organizations, which we touched on with the engineering teams and marketing teams and things like that. But ultimately, I think a good privacy team is not trying to be too legalistic or too business focused. They're trying to sit in the middle. And so I like to call it being a critical friend to the business. We try to be critical because we're trying to make sure that they're focusing on the right things and make sure that we call out new things coming down the road. But we're also trying to be a friend and say, look, I'm not just pointing in the direction and you've got to march up the hill yourself. We're trying to do this together. We're trying to go along this journey together and work it out together, because even people look to us and say, hey, you've got the answers, you're in privacy. No, we're trying to work out a lot of the stuff as well. There's new CJEU court cases coming up and things like that. So how can we do this together, be pragmatic on the one side, but also be critical? So I love that phrase, critical friend to the business. We need to make sure we're supporting them in a constructive but collaborative manner as well.
I know you have had a range of roles in a range of sized organizations. And I think one thing that's very relevant to many of the teams that we work with is how do you do effective privacy compliance with a smaller team? In some ways, that critical friendliness becomes even more critical because you're a team of 1 or 3 or something at best, and you now need to translate across all the different groups in the company. Any advice, having sat in the seat of someone at a large organization and at a smaller one, any advice for you're driving high impact despite lean resources?
I think exactly. And to me, this is really complicated because a lot of people think if you're a big organization, you must have more resources. But my experience has been is even if you had bigger organizations, you've got a size of 20, 30, 40 people in privacy, that's never enough versus the total number of people, the different projects you're doing, etc. So I think privacy is always a lean game. So, you could think of it as Lean Six Sigma or whatever. You're always on the lean side of things. So I feel that you're always on a chasing game. So I think what you need to do is you need to be willing to just roll up your sleeves and do things, find friends in the business and build those relationships. So as I said, critical friend, try build relationships. You have to try to explain why this is important, but be pragmatic because remember that they are more than likely up against it as well. Deadlines of projects and bug tickets and marketing campaigns that should have gone out 2 weeks ago, etc. So I think you have to just try to be pragmatic. What are the big risk areas you can focus on? So I always like to break it down into 2 things. I create buckets for myself. One I call it is run the business and then change the business. I always try to do that wherever I go is have these 2 buckets. And what can I do just to keep those 2 moving forward? Often run the business tends to take up 80 to 90% of my time just because there's a new contract that needs to be done with a customer, a new vendor, a new design that's coming along, and you get sucked into a lot of things. But if you don't put time in your diary to think about the change the business, how do we review how we are communicating things, how we're doing an effective training campaign, how we're doing our policy programs, you're never going to be ahead of it. So that's the first thing. Try to balance those 2. Try to make sure you're doing change the business as well as run the business. So, run the business is the DPIAs, the PIAs, the standard stuff that comes through, and change the business is your privacy program. But also try to use a framework or something like that. So, I love the Numity framework. I've never used the formal version because it's a paid version, but, I've used their framework that is free, and I've tried to link it to the ICO, the UK's Information Commissioner's Office accountability framework, which is free. And so that gives you buckets. So even when 2018, when we were pivoting people from, and this is massive organization, we still had our 10 buckets or 10 pillars that we used. And so under each one, what are you doing? Vendor management, policy management, training management. You create these buckets and you try to work out. And then the other thing for me is it's the old elephant thing. You can't eat the entire elephant. So for me, there's 2 things that I like. One is you need to think about in a maturity model, CMMI, capability maturity models in terms of we want to get to what level. But for example, in this particular area, we're happy to just be manually compliant, so a 3, let's say. In other areas, actually, because it's high risk or because we're trying to sell a service, the customers are expecting us to be able to evidence, we might want to get to a 4. We might never want to get to a 5. Don't think you always have to get to the end stream, but at least by having a maturity, in each of the pillars, you can say, look, we're not very good today, but at least we've got something. And then next year, we want to move it up and build a program around some framework that helps you to focus. I like big picture. Give me the big buckets, and then, okay, now in that bucket, what do I need to think about? Policies, third parties, transfers, offboarding, and start to work out what are your big ones that you're going to focus on first in your 20% that you try to carve out, or 30% of your week, etc. So I think it helps. And then even with small teams, I find getting a team is good, but you also need to balance it with the overhead of management and training and things like that. So make sure you're getting the right people to do the right things and building the right relationships across the business. So, yeah.
When it comes to managing this in the organization, many organizations decide to have a privacy liaisons structure or a privacy stewards program to try and get people involved, to get feedback, to get the message across the organization. So you might have representatives from different departments or teams or different offices, also if it's a global operation. I'd like to get your views on that, sort of pros and cons of following that kind of approach. Any experiences that you've had with this before?
So to be honest, I found privacy stewardship programs very hard work. They're very complicated to set up, to get the right people to nominate themselves, or you have to go through leadership and ask them to formally nominate people. I just find that it's hard to build an effective stewardship program, which is baked of people inside the divisions who want to be doing it. I think that you need to build a program which is much more accountability focused, which in my experience at more from financial institutions, etc., is you're trying to make a link between your top policies to your controls, controls frameworks and things that need to be done. And that leadership is accountable for their divisions, their departments, across financial performance, behaviors, ethics, and privacy. And so privacy is an operational thing. It's not for us privacy people to own it. It's us to advise and support them. So the more we bake it into leadership's accountability as part of their role, their fiduciary duties, etc., the better it is. So, for example, if you're an organization which is multinational, the head of country in each of the regions might have that ownership, and then the leadership underneath them for the IT function or for the sales functions have an accountability. That's the first thing. Second thing is the controls framework, I think, helps that if you link it to your risks, you can then have your controls. We used to have 7 top-level risk frameworks, and that then gets built down into the controls that the teams have to do. And they have to then be able to evidence their compliance to it or their quality of that, which feeds into their day job, that they prove their quarterly objectives or their yearly objectives, etc. I just think that if you don't bake it into somebody's accountability, it's just something else additionally on top of their list. So stewardship is good, and I think absolutely in engineering, people might be interested. For example, I try to build it into threat modeling. So some people were really excited about threat modeling, and that was their day job. It was easy to extend it a little bit into data threat modeling and privacy threat modeling, and that they became a natural steward because it just aligned to what they were doing. But otherwise, stewardship is hard to do outside of a framework that created an accountability structure. So
I'm glad you've mentioned controls and operations, because at the beginning we talked about privacy engineering and privacy compliance, but something that often gets neglected is the privacy operations, because you can have a perfect policy or standard operating procedure for everything privacy related, but unless it's actually implemented and people apply it in their business unit, then you just have paperwork and it has no value. It's what customer service does when someone phones them. Do they check whether this is the actual data subject that they're dealing with? Do they just make changes to data without following proper procedures? Do they just share data voluntarily without checking if they can share it? Do they collect data that they shouldn't be collecting? And those principles are normally in your policy. But in practice, I think it's getting that embedded into people and into units and making sure that they are accountable and responsible for actually making sure that privacy is put into practice in the organization.
And that's really interesting. So a couple of thoughts on that you just made me think of as we're talking. Firstly, is the policy says that each department head or function, department function, has a process to bring this to life. So you're almost forcing it into the policy that they shall have an effective procedure. So you're forcing procedures into the departments and they own it. So that's the first one in organizations. I've seen that happen. And I think that's quite a good way to drive it into it. And then they build into their checklists and their processes when they want to do a new marketing campaign or whatever it is. That is one of those things. Engineering, another nice thing that we used to do is there used to be a Jira ticket, which was purely for privacy. So it baked it in that every time you did a project, the template just came with these things, or the process came with these things. So I think you need to find a mechanism to take policy into action, but I don't think it's the privacy team's responsibility to do that. I prefer to have a policy and then procedures, because each department might do things in a different way. But remember that they're busy with their own things, so they might not actually go and do that. And so you need to help them, because they might not think, what does it mean, or what should I do? So that's the other thing. And lastly, something you said that just stuck in my head, I think, and again, I could be wrong, but I think it was a book I once read called Checklist or Checklists. It was a really interesting book. The guy was a surgeon. He studied to be a doctor, but he was trying to work out why some surgeries were successful and why they weren't. Apologies, I forget the author's name, but it's a really excellent book to look at. And so that one broke it exactly, and I recommend it, because to me, then that just really had an impact on me, is that checklists help, whether it's flying a plane, etc. But I think it wasn't that book, but I think a talk I heard or something like that, and it was somebody from NASA talking about how they ran their procedures and things like that. And it was a little bit old school. That would have the big old ring binder folders. I don't know if you remember those. And then the front page would have, maybe it wasn't the checklist book he was talking about it, but it would then say if the incident was this, if the incident was that, and then you'd go over to that page. And so you almost making it like an incident playbook. That's very clearly, open this document, go to chapter 6, fill out you have to do it, because when people are in the middle of what they're doing, they're not going to remember. You can do as many desktop exercises as you want. People don't remember. So for me, procedures is exactly that. What does it mean for your team? So when I create SharePoint pages, Confluence pages, I literally put the step with a link, go fill out this form, raise a privacy request, do this, do that, whatever it is. So in fact, my team decided to call our team space called Base Camp. And I love that phrase, because it's like a base camp. When you're going on a mountain climb, you start at the base camp, and the base camp tells you that if you want to go to up the top of the mountain, you go here. If you want to go to the trees or the food, or to get more clothing, you go here. So you start from something and it points you. So I'm a huge fan. I love that. Is you have single source of truth, but you point people always to the single source of truth. Because I've been in one company where there was a policy or procedure documented, people copied it and put it into their thing. Being a massive organization, there was over, I think it was 180 different sites we found that had their procedure. And then we wanted to update it and trying to find the owners of it. We just couldn't find owners that left the organization, who had editing rights. So I'm a huge fan of, it's central here, and you might give an introduction to it, but you link to the single version so you can change it. So procedures is exactly like a book at NASA. You pull it off the shelf. That is up to date. If you want to do something, you come to that. You don't have your local offline copy. You use the same, because otherwise you're going to get lost. So
how do you work with outside partners? Like, how do you get outside partners integrated in a way that's effective and scalable, or works well? I mean, because part of an outside provider's challenge is building those relationships and being able to be that critical friend sometimes. And I think the communication and the base camp access perhaps is the way around it. But any other thoughts on that?
And so that's actually shared with our external partners so that they can see it and access it, because they're our external DPO. So technically that they have the oversight position. But for me, I'm not a traditional person. I'm not a suited, booted person. I've worked at consultancies and things like that. I don't like that. So I like to work with people who you can have fun with, you can laugh, you can joke, because if you don't have a good working relationship, and it's all purely strictly by, it's just 10 minutes of consultancy and this is advice and that's it, I don't think it works, whether it's internally or externally. So for me, it's always finding a partner that you feel that you can do the long slog together on. You can have a joke, but that's just my style. I will work well in some organizations and not in other organizations where maybe they need a bit more, what do they call it? Straight-laced or whatever they call it. So my view is the critical friend is really important. And I really find that our external advisors are, and apologies for this, but they can be a real pain. They can be a real pain in the, you know what? But they're doing the critical thing, but I can have an argument with them in a friendly tone, absolutely. which is the friend part. And so we can have a debate. And that's the most, for me personally, that's the most important thing. I used to work for an organization, not everybody who's listened to this might know, called Nando's. It's a restaurant chain, it's a food chain. So they're in the hospitality space. So you work extremely hard. The hours are hugely long, but then you also love to let off steam and play. And so what they used to do, and that's maybe affected me, is start by character, start by personality traits. Does the person you're hiring naturally have the customer focus? Because you can never train that. You can train them how to cook, how to deliver, how to write software. I was in the IT team, but the point was, have you got the right attitudes and the right personality type? And then we can work on the soft skills. So for me, we spend a lot of time at work. So make sure that you're working with partners that you feel that you can get on with. And if you were in the same space, now we're so far remote, but if we were in the same country, we could have maybe set up a friendly dinner, or in South Africa, you'd call it a braai or whatever it is, and have fun together as well, even though you're not personal friends in the traditional sense, but it extends it a bit. And so my personal views when you work with externals is, yes, you absolutely need a product delivery. But remember, whether it's privacy or anything else, if you don't feel that they are responsive and friendly and want to help you and you help them both ways, then it doesn't really matter how good the product is, because when it all falls apart and you suddenly something going wrong, can you rely on them? Will they be there for you, and will you be there for them? And so my view is personality. And so anyway, it's a long way around to say critical friend. You need them internally and externally as well.
Critical friend with a human touch. Sean, it's been amazing. It's been a fascinating discussion. We've learned so much from you.
That's it for today's episode of Privacy in Practice, brought to you by VeraSafe.
If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. And we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email to podcast@verasafe.com.
And to learn more about VeraSafe's data protection and privacy services, you can visit us at verasafe.com.